In the summer of 1815, the fate of Europe stood on a knife's edge. Storm clouds gathered over the fields of Belgium as nearly 200,000 men prepared to fight for the future of the continent. Muskets were loaded, cannons rolled into position, cavalry tightened their reins. One side marched to restore a fallen empire, the other swore to end it forever. What followed was a clash of nations and ideals, a storm of fire and steel. Cavalry thundering in endless waves against walls of bayonets. Villages set ablaze, fields drowned in smoke and blood. And at the heart of it all, an undefeated guard advancing for the last time, carrying the pride of an empire on their shoulders. In a single day, an age of conquest collapsed, and a new Europe was born. The lines drawn in the mud and blood of that field would define the 19th century. In the summer of 1815, Europe stood on the edge of chaos. Napoleon Bonaparte, the French emperor who had reshaped the continent for over a decade, had escaped exile on the tiny island of Elba. He had returned to France and, almost like magic, tens of thousands of old soldiers rushed to his side. Paris welcomed him. The Bourbon king fled. And in a matter of days, Napoleon was once again emperor. But the rest of Europe refused to accept this. Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia, four great powers, declared that Napoleon was an outlaw, an enemy of peace. They raised huge armies to invade France and crush him forever. Napoleon knew his empire could not survive a long war. France was tired, its treasury drained, its manpower thin compared to the vast coalition. His only hope was speed and brilliance. His plan was daring: strike into Belgium, where two of his enemies, the British-led army under the Duke of Wellington and the Prussian army under Marshal Blucher, were gathering. If he could defeat them separately, before the Austrians and Russians arrived, he might force peace on his own terms. Now let's look at what each side brought to the battlefield. Napoleon marched with about 72,000 men. His army was built for shock and speed. French infantry carried the Charleville musket, a smoothbore weapon accurate only at close range, but deadly in volleys. His cavalry was among the finest in Europe. Cuirassiers in breastplates and plumed helmets, lancers with long spears, chasseurs and hussars for rapid strikes. Above all, Napoleon's artillery, hundreds of cannons, firing solid shot and grape shot, was mobile, precise, and devastating. And at the heart of his force stood the Imperial Guard, elite veterans with unmatched discipline, armed with muskets and bayonets, a symbol of French invincibility. Facing him was Wellington's army of about 68,000 troops. It was a mixed force, solid British infantry, Dutch Belgians, and German contingents. The British regulars carried the famous Brown Bess musket, reliable and fast to reload, giving them an edge in close firefights. Wellington also relied on heavy cavalry, the Scots Greys and the household cavalry, powerful in charges but fewer in number than the French. His artillery was lighter, but well-positioned in defensive lines designed to break enemy assaults. Wellington's greatest weapon was not metal, but strategy. He chose battlefields carefully, using terrain as a fortress. To the east marched 50,000 Prussians under Marshal Blucher. They were less uniform, armed with a mix of Prussian Potsdam muskets and foreign weapons, but they carried fierce morale. Their cavalry was aggressive, their artillery reliable though not as refined as Napoleon's. Their real strength lay in numbers and determination. They could take losses, regroup, and return to fight again. So here was the stage. Napoleon, fewer men but faster, with deadly cavalry and world-class artillery. Wellington, a mixed army, disciplined where it mattered, strong in defense, with British muskets and cavalry waiting for the right moment. Blucher, rough but resilient, his soldiers less well-equipped, yet driven by sheer will to fight Napoleon to the end. And so, in June 1815, Napoleon moved first. He crossed into Belgium, hoping to drive a wedge between Wellington and Blucher. Before they could join forces, the fate of Europe would be decided not in Vienna's palaces, but on muddy fields, beneath gray skies, with muskets, sabers, and roaring cannon. This was the road to Waterloo. Napoleon's strategy was simple in design but deadly in intent. Drive a wedge between Wellington and Blücher, defeat each separately, and then march on Brussels before the coalition could recover. To achieve this, he advanced with his army split into three wings, one under Marshal Ney, one under Marshal Grouchy, and his own central command. On June 16, 1815, 2 days before Waterloo, the first great clashes erupted. Napoleon himself turned toward the Prussians at Ligny, bringing about 68,000 French troops against 84,000 Prussians. The battlefield was a patchwork of villages, streams, and farmhouses, perfect terrain for bloody, close-quarter fighting. The French infantry pushed forward in waves, their Charleville muskets cracking in volleys, bayonets flashing as they stormed into villages like Sainte and Ligny itself. Artillery thundered, blasting buildings into rubble. The French cavalry cuirassiers, heavy horsemen in steel breastplates, crashed into Prussian lines with sabers raised high. The Prussians resisted fiercely. Their muskets, many old Potsdam models, fired back from behind hedgerows and churchyards. Blücher himself, nearly 70 years old, rode at the front, inspiring his men with reckless bravery. But the French artillery's superiority began to tell. Cannon after cannon smashed the Prussian ranks, and late in the day, Napoleon unleashed his Imperial Guard. These elite veterans surged forward, muskets and bayonets cutting through exhausted Prussians. By nightfall, the Prussians were beaten. Casualties were staggering. Over 20,000 men lost. Yet Blücher was not destroyed. In the chaos, he was unhorsed and nearly trampled. But his soldiers carried him to safety. Instead of retreating east toward Germany, as Napoleon expected, Blücher regrouped to the north, keeping the chance of joining Wellington alive. While Napoleon fought at Ligny, Marshal Ney engaged Wellington's forces at Quatre Bras, a vital crossroads. Ney had about 24,000 French troops, while Wellington's scattered contingents, eventually numbering 25,000 to 30,000, rushed to hold the position. The fighting was fierce and chaotic. French infantry advanced in column, drummers beating time, muskets at the ready. Their cavalry, lancers with pennants fluttering from their spears, charged across the fields. British and Dutch troops formed squares, a defensive formation bristling with bayonets, firing disciplined volleys from their brown-best muskets. Square formations could repel cavalry, but only if they held firm. The battle seesawed for hours. French cannons roared, mowing down Allied lines. But Wellington's leadership shone. He moved reinforcements with precision, his artillery firing steadily from ridges, his infantry holding square after square. By nightfall, Ney had failed to break through. Quatre Bras remained in Allied hands. The results of June 16th were mixed. At Ligny, Napoleon had won a bloody victory, yet the Prussians were not destroyed and still in the fight. At Quatre Bras, Ney had failed to crush Wellington, leaving the Anglo-Allied army intact. Napoleon had aimed to separate and annihilate his enemies, but now both Wellington and Blücher were battered, yet unbroken. Worse for Napoleon, their armies still had the chance to unite. The emperor had struck hard, but not hard enough. The stage was now set for the final confrontation. The evening of June 17th was drenched in storm. Heavy rain poured down over the Belgian countryside, turning the dirt roads into rivers of mud. Soldiers trudged forward, their uniforms soaked, boots sinking with every step. Napoleon's men, exhausted from marching and fighting, collapsed on wet ground, clutching their muskets for warmth. The night sky flashed with lightning, and thunder rolled like cannon fire. The retreat from Quatre Bras had been tense. Wellington's army pulled back north toward the ridge of Mont Saint-Jean, with French cavalry snapping at their heels. In the twilight, French lancers and cuirassiers galloped furiously, spears lowered, sabers gleaming, hunting down British and Dutch stragglers. Wagons overturned in the mud, riders cut down as the cavalry swept through. But Wellington's rearguard fought doggedly. British infantry formed squares again and again. their brown best muskets cracking in disciplined volleys. Cavalry horses screamed as bullets ripped through them, yet still the French pressed on. One dramatic chase unfolded near the village of Genappe. French cavalry charged into the narrow streets, sabers flashing, but Wellington's household cavalry counterattacked in the darkness. Horses crashed against horses, men slashing at each other in the rain. The clash was brutal, chaotic, with riders thrown from saddles, muskets fired point blank. In the end, the British managed to hold, and the army escaped further north. By midnight, Wellington's forces reached the ridge near Waterloo. The ground was muddy, soaked, but it was a strong position. Wellington surveyed it in the flicker of lanterns and knew this would be the place to stand. "Here," he is said to have muttered, "we will fight." Meanwhile, Napoleon's troops encamped just south of the ridge. Fires sputtered in the rain, men huddled under torn cloaks trying to sleep. But the emperor, restless, studied the enemy lines through the storm. He believed he had Wellington cornered. If Grouchy could keep the Prussians at bay, Napoleon was confident that tomorrow he would crush the Anglo-Allied army. Yet fate would not make it easy. The rain had turned the fields into a swamp. The cannons, so vital to Napoleon's strength, would sink in the mud, their wheels stuck, their powder damp. At dawn, the battlefield would be a bog, slowing every movement. For the soldiers of both sides, the night was endless. They shivered, whispered prayers, tightened straps on muskets and sabers. Some carved initials into the butts of their guns. Others scribbled letters they might never send. Lightning flashed over the ridge, revealing endless rows of men waiting for dawn. The chase was over. The trap was set. Morning would bring the final storm, the Battle of Waterloo. Dawn broke on June 18, 1815, gray and heavy with mist. The battlefield was soaked, fields churned into mud. Soldiers stood silently in long lines, muskets glistening with moisture, faces pale in the dim light. Both sides waited, nerves stretched to the breaking point. Napoleon delayed his assault until late morning, hoping the ground would dry enough for his cannons to be effective. At last, the order came. Around 11:30 a.m., French guns roared to life. Over 200 cannons thundered across the valley, the air filled with whistling iron shot. Cannonballs smashed into Allied lines, tearing through files of men, exploding into clouds of mud and blood. Grape shot, a storm of musket balls fired from artillery, shredded anything in its path. But the sodden ground swallowed much of the fury. Wheels sank deep, recoil muffled, projectiles skipped short. Wellington's men crouched behind the ridge, spared the worst of the barrage. They clung to the earth, waiting. Then came the infantry attack on Hougoumont, a walled farm anchoring Wellington's right flank. French columns surged forward, drums beating, flags snapping in the wind. Muskets blazed, bayonets glittered as they rushed the gates. Inside, British guardsmen waited. The gates slammed shut, and a savage fight erupted. Muskets fired through loopholes in stone walls, defenders hurling back ladders, even using axes and shovels in desperation. French soldiers hacked at the doors, poured through breaches, only to be driven out again. Hougoumont became a slaughterhouse, drawing thousands of French away from the main battle. While the farm burned, Napoleon struck at the center. French infantry advanced in deep columns, their Charleville muskets flashing in volleys. The valley echoed with drum beats, shouted orders, and the crack of musket fire. Across the ridge, Allied infantry fired back with Brown Bess muskets, their volleys steady and disciplined. The two lines poured fire into each other, smoke rolling thick across the fields, choking men as they reloaded frantically. Cavalry charges soon followed. French cuirassiers, breastplates gleaming, lances lowered, galloped across the mud. Horses pounded forward, the earth shaking beneath thousands of hooves. They slammed into Allied positions, cutting down men with sabers, trampling those too slow to form up. But Wellington's infantry held firm. Time and again, battalions formed squares, tight, bristling hedges of bayonets. French cavalry wheeled around them, pistols firing, sabers flashing, but the squares would not break. Horses reared and screamed, riders toppled, and volleys of musket fire hurled the cavalry back. It was a deadly dance of charge and repel, repeated over and over. All across the battlefield, chaos reigned. Cannon fire rolled like thunder, musket smoke blinded both sides, and the cries of the wounded filled the air. Men ran, stumbled, fought hand to hand in ditches and hedges. Officers bellowed, drums rattled, flags dipped and rose again. By early afternoon, the battle was still undecided. Napoleon had hurled wave after wave at Wellington's line, and though battered, the Anglo-Allied army still stood. Wellington, calm as ever, rode along his ridge, steadying his men with quiet words. Stand firm. Yet the French attacks grew fiercer. The fate of Europe now hung by a thread, and both sides knew the next few hours would decide it all. By mid-afternoon, Napoleon grew impatient. His infantry assaults had failed to break Wellington's line, and Hougoumont still held like an unyielding thorn. So he turned to the arm that had so often brought him victory, his cavalry. Marshal Ney, brave but reckless, was given command. Mistaking movement on the ridge as signs of retreat, Ney launched charge after charge with thousands of horsemen. Over 9,000 French cavalry surged forward, cuirassiers in steel breastplates, dragoons, lancers, and hussars. It was one of the greatest cavalry assaults in history. The ground trembled as wave upon wave thundered across the valley. Horses pounded through mud, hooves splashing, riders shouting, "Vive l'Empereur!" Their sabers flashed in the smoke, lances leveled like a forest of spears. It was a sight to chill the blood, an avalanche of steel and muscle crashing toward Wellington's ridge. But the Anglo-Allied infantry was ready. At the last moment, battalions wheeled into square formations, hollow boxes bristling with bayonets on every side. Inside, officers barked orders while drummers beat the steady rhythm. Muskets leveled outward. The French cavalry smashed into them. First cuirassiers, then lancers, then hussars circling like wolves. The battle turned into a deadly dance of charge and repel. Riders circled the squares, firing pistols point blank, slashing with sabers, trying to force an opening. Horses screamed as musket volleys tore into their ranks. Men were hurled from saddles, trampled in the mud. Yet the squares held. Not a single one broke. Again and again, Ney hurled his cavalry forward. Over 13 separate charges crashed against the Allied line. Cannons were dragged up the hill by sheer muscle, fired at close range into the squares, only to be overrun when infantry counterattacked. Still, Ney would not stop. His face blackened with powder, his sword broken, he seized a musket and led on foot, urging his men forward. But exhaustion set in. Horses collapsed from wounds, riders staggered back. The valley was strewn with dead and dying, an ocean of fallen men and beasts. The French cavalry, magnificent in its fury, had failed to shatter Wellington's defense. And then, on the French right flank, new danger appeared. In the distance, dark columns marched through the smoke and woods. Drums rolled, banners fluttered black and white. The Prussians were arriving. Blücher had kept his promise. At first, they struck the village of Plancenoit, clashing with Napoleon's right wing. French infantry scrambled to hold them off, but the pressure grew by the hour. Napoleon had hoped Grouchy would keep the Prussians away, but Grouchy was too far, chasing shadows. Now the Prussians were here, their muskets adding to the storm, their presence stretching Napoleon's lines to the breaking point. On Wellington's ridge, his soldiers, battered and bloodied, still clung on. But now with Blücher's arrival, the balance of the battle shifted. Napoleon was running out of time. By early evening, the battlefield was a vision of hell. Smoke hung over the fields, cannon craters scarred the earth, and thousands of dead and dying littered the mud. Wellington's army had endured hours of pounding assaults. The French were exhausted, but not yet broken. Napoleon knew the moment of decision had come. At around 7:30 p.m., he gathered his last reserve, the legendary Imperial Guard. These were his veterans, men who had never known defeat, their tall, bearskin hats and steady steps striking fear wherever they marched. As they advanced up the ridge, drums beating, the cry rang out, "Vive l'Empereur!" The guard moved in perfect order, bayonets fixed, Charleville muskets gleaming in the dim light. Behind them, the remnants of the French army looked on, praying their heroes would turn the tide. They climbed the slope, musket fire rattling around them. Allied cannon blasted gaps in their ranks, but still they pressed on. "La Garde avance!" they shouted. The guard advances. For a moment it seemed possible. The British line wavered, but Wellington had held back his own reserves. As the guard crested the ridge, they were met with point-blank volleys from the British Guards and Highland regiments. The Brown Bess muskets roared, ripping through the French ranks. Still, the guard pushed upward, returning fire, stepping over their fallen comrades. Then came the order. Charge! British infantry surged forward with bayonets, while cavalry swept in from the flanks. The Imperial Guard staggered, then faltered. A shout went up. "La Garde recule!" The Guard is retreating. It was the first time in history that the Guard had broken. Panic spread like fire. Across the battlefield, French soldiers saw the Guard falling back and their hearts collapsed. What had been stubborn resistance turned into chaos. Muskets were thrown down, men fled toward the rear, horses bolted riderless. The Prussians surged in from Plancenoit, driving deep into the French flank, cutting off retreat. Napoleon tried desperately to rally his men. He rode among them, shouting, "Rally! Rally! Stand with me!" But it was too late. The great army dissolved into a fleeing mob. Wellington raised his hat and gave the long-awaited signal. His line advanced at last, sweeping the French from the ridge. As darkness fell, the road to France was choked with fugitives. Wagons overturned, guns abandoned, soldiers running for their lives. The mighty Grande Armée, once the terror of Europe, was no more. Napoleon escaped the battlefield, but his empire was finished. Within days he abdicated, this time for good. He would be sent far away to the lonely island of St. Helena, where he would never return. Waterloo was over. One day, one battle had reshaped the destiny of Europe.